The leaders of the leading countries of the European Union, France, and Germany, have agreed to a joint effort against a country that right now is putting them in great danger, and it's not, it would seem, that allies of Berlin and Paris of the United States of America as the US is threatening Europe and whether it can do something about it as a result. The U.S. Representative Victoria Nuland, during the conference when she was asked about the interests of the European Union in Ukraine, she didn't give a damn about the European Union, to put it simply. She said that the European Union with its interests, and this phrase is still a clear reflection of the attitude of the United States towards its European allies. The U.S. has repeatedly demonstrated this attitude in practice, for example after Donald Trump decided to abandon nuclear. The phrase is still a clear reflection of the attitude of the United States towards its European allies. Tens of billions of euros with Iranian partners. Europe was loudly outraged, promising to protect its companies legally and economically, but in fact, did nothing when the US dragged Australia. Wolf 100 persuaded the Australian government to back out of a contract it had already signed for French submarines in favor of British ones. Paris was loudly outraged, calling it treason, but after a while, it calmed down. However, none of this betrayal compares to the so-called Inflation Relief Act. This euphonious document proposes subsidies of hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies to green companies for essentially high-tech industries that would create their products in the United States. Simply put, the law encourages these companies to move their businesses to America, where there are more benefits and cheaper energy. The law encourages European companies to move to the United States, thereby deindustrializing the old world. That is, it simply deprives Europe of industry and the future of human resources. In one word, the difference between this stab in the back and the others is that it was made at a time when Europe and the US should seem to be more united than ever, at a time when the United States and Europe seemingly shoulder to shoulder confront Russia and Ukraine. It is Europe, or rather its economy, which bears the main burden of the conflict is on the European side, while at this key moment, the US is not helping. On the contrary, it uses the situation to make the American economy as strong as possible in the face of the inevitable the American economy before the inevitable global financial crisis at the expense of both enemies and as allies. Attempts by the European Union to convince the US not to make this strike have failed to retreat into the beginning of 2023, and now the French President and the German Chancellor are saying that together have come up with some kind of response plan for the European Union. In general terms, it involves investment in European industry, as Macron explained from public and private sources. The problem is that there are no specific details of this plan. No, moreover, according to Reuters reports, the sides have not even agreed on them. German officials say Berlin sees no particular need for a new European Union sovereign fund, which France says it necessary to invest in European industry and keep its competitiveness compared to US firms, benefiting both governments. Also only generally agreed to work on a complete overhaul of European energy. France wants to move ahead as quickly as possible because of its emphasis on developing nuclear energy. Berlin is very skeptical of this rush, says the publication. No agreement may be reached. It's hard for the symmetrical Europeans to respond, including the fact that the Europeans cannot afford similar spending, but Europeans can hardly afford simple protectionist measures either. That's a lesson they had already learned under Trump. And it turned out that the European potential costs are much higher than those of the US, explains to the newspaper The View of a senior researcher and memorandum writer Dmitry of Officers Belsky. To impose a trade war on the US, Europe is also unlikely to be able to. The US have a very substantial trade balance deficit, so the Americans can impose higher duties on much more goods than the Europeans. Continue Dmitry E. Officers Belsky. Hi, the situation is beginning to vaguely resemble a reaction to the as a result. The situation is beginning to vaguely resemble the European Union's reaction to forcing The European companies withdrew from Iran under threat of sanctions. Then Paris and Berlin also promised to create some mechanisms to circumvent potential US sanctions to protect European investors. However, nothing has been agreed upon. The real purpose of the Franco-German statement is not to protect European industry from American encroachment, but to demonstrate. Firstly, this demonstration is needed by the European Union, which is Waiting for its leaders to act. In general, there is great concern in Europe in its industrial. The industry that the incentives that the United States has provided, especially in the green transition, and are so attractive that there will be a shift of manufacturing activity from Europe to the United States. Worry Greek Prime Minister leader recall far from the most industrialized country in the European Union. Secondly, this demonstration is needed by the French and Germans themselves to solve their bilateral problems. According to one version is that Germany and France want to use the joint project to fight era as a platform to bring them closer to each other. In recent months, Paris and Berlin have been at odds over energy, defense and finance, as well as the controversial Scholz project to lower the price. The controversial €200 billion energy price reduction project, developed without the participation of the French government, has been the culmination of a series of tensions between Paris and Berlin. In the French countryside, these tensions culminated in Macron's disdain for Scholz through the cancellation of the joint press conference at the end of the October summit, writes Politico, and now the sides are trying to reach an agreement amid the need for a common struggle with the Americans. The Franco-German engine is a compromised machine, well-oiled but sometimes noisy and requiring hard work, said about Scholz. The question is, how skilled are the maintenance? How well do the mechanics work for this machine, and how well do they work for the people who built it? The question, alas, is rhetorical. The maintenance of this machine by these technicians may lead to